skupnem projektu Študijskega centra za narodno spravo in Muzeja novejše zgodovine Slovenije se srečujemo ob 20-letnici padca železne zavese. Naslov Totalitarizmi, novo vprašanje in novi izzivi je seveda povezan z dogodki, o katerih se pogovarjamo. Na stopnišču pravzaprav srečujemo slovensko verzijo predelave železne zavese in zidu z ustanovitvijo prvih političnih strank. Jaz verjamem, da je ta slovenska umestitev v evropski prostor še kako potrebna, ker tudi zdaj, tako kot za čas temne strani meseca, tudi za svetlejšo stran slovenske tranzicije opažamo, da je v mednarodnem prostoru razmeroma zanemarjena in prav gotovo so vprašanja, ki se jih bomo lotevali skozi današnji dan in potem tudi z odmevi na objavo teh prispevkov in pa z nadaljnjimi aktivnosti tista, ki nas umeščajo v te temeljne trende tega slovenskega in evropskega samospraševanja. Jaz mislim, da bo priložnosti za pogovor še dovolj in prosim za pozdravno besedo še gospod Andreja Valič, direktorico Študijskega centra za narodno spravo.
Spoštovane gospe, spoštovani gospodje, spoštovani visoki gostje, lepo pozdravljeni na mednarodnem znanstvenem posvetu, ki ga organizirata, kot je že gospod Dežman povedal, skupaj Študijski center za narodno spravo in pa Muzej novejše zgodovine Slovenije. Posvet smo naslovili Totalitarizmi, vprašanja in izzivi in pa podnaslov ob 20-letnici padca železne zavese, torej dan posveta nekako ni bil izbran naključno. Prvi novembrski dnevi so postregli v 20. stoletju s prelomnimi dogodki, ki so zelo usodno vplivali na zgodovino sveta, Evrope in pa Slovenije. V prvih novembrskih dneh oziroma po ruskem koledarju v oktobrskih dneh se je leta 1917 začela tako imenovana oktobrska revolucija, torej dogajanja, ki so vodila v enega največjih in najusodnejših, lahko rečemo tudi najhujših eksperimentov v človeški zgodovini, v ustvarjanje komunističnega raja oziroma kraljestva svobode, kot ga je imenoval Engels, ustvarjanje novega človeka, nove družbe, krasnega novega sveta. Ob tem pa so ljudje doživljali brezobzirno teptanje človekovih pravic, povzročene so bile neslutene krivice, gorje stotinam milijonov ljudi. Za sabo je ta eksperiment puščal smrt, lakoto, opustošenje v naravi in v ljudeh. Na današnji dan pred 71 leti se je v Nemčiji začela tako imenovana kristalna noč. Pogrom nad Judi, sramotenje Judov, uničevanje judovskega premoženja, nekaj desetin pobitih in nekaj 10.000 aretiranih Judov je bil spet samo uvod v tako imenovano končno rešitev, torej odločitev nacističnega uničevalnega stroja v začetku leta 1942, da dokončno opravi z Judi in s tem zagreši najhujšo kršitev človekovih pravic. Na današnji dan, pred 20 leti, pa smo z zadržanim dihom spremljali prizore, večina preko televizijskih sprejemnikov, iz razdeljenega Berlina, ki je simboliziral razdeljeni narod in razdeljeno Evropo. Na eni strani zidu demokracija, politični pluralizem, svobodne volitve, ekonomska in družbena avtonomija, pravna država, spoštovanje posameznika in njegovih pravic ter svoboščin, močna civilna družba. Na drugi strani zidu močna, vseobsegajoča komunistična država, ena sama partija, ideološki monopol, nadzor nad privatnim življenjem, velika moč tajnih političnih služb, vojske in policije, podrejenih vladajoči politični eliti. Berlinski zid je sicer padal, vedno jasneje pa postaja dejstvo, da je ostal zid oziroma ostanki zidu v glavah in srcih prevelikega števila ljudi, ki so bili desetletja ujeti v totalitarizmih. Posledice se kažejo v poškodovanosti mentalitet, ki ne zaznavajo in ne priznavajo obče človeških vrednot, kot so človekove pravice, demokracija, svoboda, solidarnost in tako dalje. Naj svojo trditev samo na kratko ilustriram z eno od meritev javnega mnenja v postkomunističnih državah. Tale je bila objavljena v Economistu 4. novembra, torej postkomunistične države oziroma javno navdušenje v teh postkomunističnih državah za demokracijo in kapitalizem se, kot vidimo, zmanjšuje, predvsem v tistih državah, ki so najrevnejše. No, jaz bi počasi zaključila, pripravila sem še veliko več, morda bi opozorila samo še na nekaj pomembnih korakov, ki so bili storjeni v zadnjih letih v evropskem prostoru v procesu sprave oziroma procesu tranzicijske pravičnosti. Tukaj jih imate pred seboj in jaz bi posebej izpostavila prvo javno tribuno o zločinih totalitarnih režimov, ki je bila v sodelovanju z Evropsko komisijo organizirana v času slovenskega predsedovanja Evropski uniji v aprilu 2008 in s tem se je proces v evropskem prostoru zelo ukrepil in ena taka otipljiva posledica te prve javne tribune je Evropski zbornik Crimes Committed by Totalitarian Regimes. Proces se nadaljuje z deklaracijami o evropski zavesti in totalitarizmu, deklaracijo OVSE-ja, z naročilom nacionalnih poročil, ki jih je naročila Evropska komisija in v letu 2010 namerava sprožiti javno razpravo in pa z oblikovanjem Evropske platforme spomina in vesti, ki bo povezovala institucije, ki se ukvarjajo z raziskovanjem zločinov totalitarizma in samih totalitarizmov v okviru Evropske unije. Torej, jaz bi želela ob koncu se seveda iskreno zahvaliti vsem, ki ste prišli danes, ki boste aktivno sodelovali v razpravi. Zahvaljujem se Muzeju novejše zgodovine Slovenije, zahvaljujem se svojim sodelavcem Študijskega centra za narodno spravo, moderatorjema, vsem referentom in želim uspešno delo. Hvala lepa.
Tako, in če mi dovolite, da predam besedo gospodu Lovru Šturmu, jaz bi, ker sem do neke mere lahko spremljal razvoj v teh zadnjih letih, tudi sodeloval pri nekaterih akcijah, zlasti v okviru komisije Vlade Republike Slovenije za urejanje vprašanj prikritih grobišč, bi rekel, da je gospod Šturm verjetno oseba, ki bo v procesu tranzicije v Sloveniji zaslužila posebno mesto. Gre tako za te že omenjene evropske pobude, kot tudi za izjemno pospeševanje teh procesov tranzicijske pravičnosti v Sloveniji. Gospod Šturm, izvolite.
Hvala lepa. Zahvaljujem se za povabilo organizatorjem tega pomembnega mednarodnega srečanja in vse spoštovane navzoče najlepše pozdravljam. Slovenija je edina država v Evropi, ki je doživela vse tri tako značilne totalitarne režime 20. stoletja. Res, da je zadnji, se pravi komunistični, trajal najdlje časa in njegove posledice čutimo tudi še dan danes. Kajti prehod iz sistema, ki ne zagotavlja svobode, v sistem, ki zagotavlja svobodo, je seveda težak in dolgotrajen, vendar gotovo ni mogoče dvomiti, da bo tudi ta tranzicija seveda izvedena tako, kot mora biti za vzpostavitev svobodne demokratične družbe. Je pa res, da se to čez noč seveda vedno ne more zgoditi. V Sloveniji, kot tudi v drugih državah vzhodne Evrope, je bil pač ta prehod postopen, čeprav se je pa zgodil dejansko kot posledica dejanja, ki se ga dan danes spominjamo, torej padca železne zavese s simbolnim rušenjem Berlinskega zida. Ta dogodek je bil takrat zelo pomemben in je gotovo bistveno vplival tudi na nadaljne procese preobrazbe političnih sistemov v vzhodni Evropi in seveda med drugim tudi v nekdanji Jugoslaviji, pa tudi v Sloveniji. Slišali smo že doslej, da današnji datum nosi neko zgodovinsko reminiscenco, ne samo na dogodke povezane zvezi s padcem Berlinskega zidu, temveč tudi na, kot smo že slišali, na tako imenovano kristalno noč, pa tudi dejansko na začetek oktobrske revolucije, res neke vrste simbola najdemo v tem datumu. V Sloveniji se je prva državna institucija, ki se je zelo resno soočila z vprašanjem nekdanjega totalitarnega komunističnega sistema, je bilo Ustavno sodišče. V več kot 12 zelo pomembnih ustavnosodnih odločitvah, ki so bile sprejete med leti 1992 do 1998, je opisalo karakteristike nekdanjega nedemokratičnega enopartijskega in totalitarnega režima in pokazalo tudi bistvene komponente svobodne demokratične družbe. Kaj definira svobodno demokratično družbo? Tu odločitve so gotovo zelo pomembne in še vedno služijo kot temelj za vsakršno opredeljevanje v teh pogledih. Ne nazadnje Ustavno sodišče bilo tudi prvi in, kolikor vem, zaenkrat še edini državni organ, ki je v svojih lastnih prostorih postavil tudi simbolično spominsko obeležje žrtvam komunizma po letu 1945. Ustavno sodišče se namreč nahaja v stavbi nedavne gospodarske zbornice in postavilo je svečano obeležje leta 1997 vsem tistim članom nekdanje trgovinske zbornice, ki so v komunističnem režimu izgubili bodisi svojo svobodo, bodisi svoje premoženje, bodisi svoje življenje. In s temi tremi definicijami so podane tudi najhujše kršitve ne samo človekovih pravic, ampak tudi temeljnih svoboščin v nekdanjem sistemu. Kot dan danes zelo veliko govorimo o človekovih pravicah, včasih pozabljamo na temeljne svoboščine. Temeljne svoboščine so zelo pomembne in njihovo zagotavljanje je predpogoj za razvoj svobodne demokratične družbe. V mandatu 2005 do 2008 smo si prizadevali, da ukrepimo prizadevanja za razvoj svobodne demokratične družbe in da skušamo pospešiti vse procese, ki omogočajo med drugim tudi uresničevanje teh opredelitev in stališč Ustavnega sodišča Slovenije. Če povzamem samo nekaj bistvenih značilnosti, najprej na nacionalnem področju. V tem času je začela zelo intenzivno ponovno delovati Komisija za popravo krivic, ki je bila res da vzpostavljena že predtem, vendar je imela številne težave, zlasti na začetku, potem pa je zelo počasi reševala vloge, ki so se kopičile pred njo. V tem mandatu smo bistveno pospešili reševanje vlog, tako da je dan danes vlog, ki so bile na podlagi predpisov, ki omogočajo popravo krivic, že več kot 28,000 rešenih vlog. Prizadevali smo se tudi pospešiti procese denacionalizacije. Tu je številka prišla približno do 39,000, kar je sorazmerno visoka številka, ostalo je še nekaj tisoč zadev, kar številčno gledano ni več veliko, so pa med njimi tudi nekatere pomembne zadeve, tako da vsebinsko so pa še vedno nekatera težja vprašanja ostala nerešena. Med drugim smo tudi v letu 2007 Na dan človekovih pravic, 10. december, je vlada organizirala prvič državno proslavo, osrednjo državno proslavo, s kateri smo počastili politične zapornike v nekdanji državi. Tudi ta proslava je bila na nek način povezana z tem, kar smo našli v arhivih Ministrstva za pravosodje. V arhivih Ministrstva za pravosodje smo namreč odkrili evidenco političnih zapornikov, kartoteko pravzaprav političnih zapornikov po letu 1945, ki je bila do takrat nekje založena med drugimi omarami in spisi. Pri natančnem pregledu vsebine tega arhiva smo to našli in vso kartoteko predali tudi tja, kamor sodi v arhiv Republike Slovenije. No, sporedno so potekala tudi, bom rekel, prizadevanja in aktivnosti na mednarodnem področju, zlasti seveda v okviru Evropske unije. Takrat smo se že pripravljali na predsedovanje in smo zato tudi zelo aktivno sodelovali pri vseh vprašanjih, s katerimi se je ukvarjal Evropski svet, zlasti v sestavi ministrov za pravosodje. Takrat se je pripravljala posebna resolucija oziroma okvirni sklep o diskriminaciji, o prepovedi diskriminacije na podlagi rasnega razlikovanja. Seveda smo to podprli, so pa nekatere države opozarjale, da je potrebno pozornost posvetiti tudi oblikam diskriminacije, ki so nastale zaradi političnega prepričanja ali recimo premoženja, pač diskriminacije, ki so se zgodile v drugi polovici prejšnjega stoletja, zlasti v državah, ki so bile pod komunističnim sistemom. Članice Evropske unije so prisluhnile tem opozorilom, ki so prišle najprej iz vrst baltskih držav, potem pa so se priključile tudi druge vzhodnoevropske države in tudi Slovenija se je temu priključila, tako da je bilo že takrat sprejeto načelno stališče, da je treba oblikovati tudi ustrezen instrument Evropske unije, ki bo posvetil posebno pozornost tudi vsem žrtvam totalitarnih sistemov. Podoben proces je tekel tudi v Evropskem parlamentu. Ta je pripeljal nenazadnje tudi do sprejema znane resolucije Evropskega parlamenta, ki se je izrekel do vseh totalitarnih sistemov in drugih nedemokratičnih režimov. V okviru Evropskega sveta pa je dozorelo spoznanje, to je bilo že v letu 2007, da je treba pripraviti neko javno tribuno, public hearing, na katerem bi razpravljali tudi o posledicah komunističnega sistema v širšem evropskem prostoru in da je treba za ta posvet tudi pripraviti ustrezno gradivo. No, v letu 2008 v prvi polovici je Slovenija predsedovala Evropskemu svetu in v okviru ministrstva za pravosodje smo takrat uspeli pripraviti to konferenco in gradivo za to konferenco. Jaz želim povedati, da je komisar za pravosodje, to je bil gospod Jacques Barrot, je izkazal polno razumevanje za pripravo te konference. Dogovorili smo se tudi takrat z Evropsko unijo, da stroške te konference deli Evropska komisija in Slovenija kot predsedujoča pol na pol in sicer na ta način, da Slovenija prevzame svojo polovico stroškov s tem, da natisne ustrezen zbornik z tega posveta, samo organizacijo posveta in vse drugo pa prevzame Evropska komisija in posvet se je res zgodil 8. aprila leta 2008 v Bruslu. Do takrat zbornik seveda še ni bil pripravljen, vendar na tem posvetu je bilo predstavljenih zelo veliko zanimivih prispevkov, ki so jih številni udeleženci kasneje še dopolnili in v mesecih po tem posvetu smo vse te prispevke pač obdelali, uredniško uredili in izdali potem ob koncu predsedovanja Slovenije Evropskemu svetu v obliki posebnega zbornika, ki je bil prvi takšen zbornik in ki ima seveda zdaj že nadaljevanja. Tako ti posveti se nadaljujo, tudi zborniki se nadaljujo, vendar Slovenija je bila prva tista, ki je dejansko uresničila izdajo tega zbornika. No, in na koncu postrelim še z enim podatkom, spet se nanaša na Slovenijo, tu gre pa zdaj za osebe, ki so bile sodno rehabilitirane zaradi krivične obsodilne sodbe v procesih, ki so bili navidezni sodni procesi po drugi svetovni vojni. Število teh v celoti rehabilitiranih obsojencev je v Sloveniji zdaj že več kot 3500, kar je skupaj s številkami, ki sem jih prej navedel, pomemben dokaz, da Slovenija skuša v okviru možnosti, ki jih ima, seveda na civiliziran način prispevati k popravi krivic nekdanjega totalitarnega sistema. Ob koncu pa mi dovolite še neko zanimivost, ker sem sam tudi sodeloval takrat pred 20 leti pri teh in napeto spremljal ta proces prehoda iz nekdanjega političnega sistema v nov demokratični politični sistem, se seveda zelo dobro spominjamo tudi takratnega padca Berlinskega zida, spominjamo se tudi dogodkov, ki so se hitro zatem zvrstili v drugih vzhodnih evropskih državah. Za Slovenijo pa se je takrat zgodilo tudi nekaj, kar je bilo skoraj da neopazno, vendar dan danes lahko presodimo, da je imelo pa zelo pomemben politično-gospodarski efekt. V Sloveniji je bila namreč lastnina takrat posebej kvalificirana kot družbena lastnina in precejšno vlogo so imeli razni tako imenovani samoupravni organi v vseh proizvodnih organizacijah, da rečem, tako da razumemo, v podjetjih, v tovarnah, vse povsod. In bili so posebni organi, tudi organi, delavski sveti, organi samoupravne kontrole, ki v prejšnjem sistemu dejansko niso zaživeli. Zato, ker so bili vsi pod vplivom partije. Vendar je še nekdanja socialistična oblast v Sloveniji v zadnjih mesecih pred izvedbo volitev in pred vzpostavitvijo novega demokratičnega sistema v Sloveniji, ki se je zgodil spomladi leta 90, je v obdobju po padcu Berlinskega zida, ko je bilo seveda že definitivno jasno, da je z nekdanjim sistemom konec. Takrat je tedanja skupščina, republiška skupščina v Sloveniji, čez noč potihem ukinila vse elemente samoupravnega sistema. Ko bi ostali in v veljavi tudi po izvedenih volitvah in po postavitvi večstrankarskega sistema, bi lahko presodili, kaj bi to pomenilo pri tranziciji lastnine. Ko bi lahko pač elementi večstrankarskega sistema vplivali na to, da odločenje o teh prehodih ne bi bilo enostransko. No, to se ni zgodilo, vse to je bilo tako rekoč čez noč in bliskovito ukinjeno in nenazadnje je to tudi pripeljalo do neke popolnoma svojevrstne tranzicije lastnine v Sloveniji, ki je povzročila številne probleme, ki pa jih in posledice teh problemov pa čutimo tudi še danes. Hvala lepa za pozornost.
It's a hardworking man. He's in Slovenian public. The whole extent of his work is not very well known, but the topic we can discuss now is also very familiar to Slovenian public. As you can see, this is Croatian translation of Minister and the Massacres, and when I was lecturing in Zagreb 2 weeks ago, I got this study about the same case. So we are still working on the problem, and I hope in these 20 years Slovenia has also made some progress, so we can enter the dialogue with Mr. Nikolaj Tolstoy. He will give some introduction, and then we can debate. We have an hour approximately, and I hope we will use his precious visit in Slovenia.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm sorry I can't speak Slovenian, but I can partly understand because it's similar to Russian, of course. This is my first return to Slovenia for 15 years, and it's wonderful to come to this beautiful museum, which I didn't think was even planned, was it? Or perhaps like a baby in the mind's eye. And to see how these awful stories are now becoming widely known and properly recorded. My own confrontation with communist totalitarianism came quite abruptly in 1956 when Bulgarin and Khrushchev paid the first state visit of Soviet leaders to Great Britain. And I was young and enthusiastic and very indignant. And I went to Victoria Station where they were arriving, and I took with me, someone had given me a big poster which said, "Keep the red beasts out." And when I held this up, I saw Bulgarin and Khrushchev come out, and Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister, embracing Khrushchev, which disgusted me. And I held up my notice. It was immediately snatched away from me. And I thought this was communists who were at work, punched one of them, as one does when you're young. But it turned out they were British policemen in plain clothes. And I was taken away. Next day I was fined for, I can't remember what exactly. And on the new BBC News that evening, people were amused who knew me, were amused to hear that it said, "A young man calling himself Tolstoy has been arrested." And so that, funnily enough, was the very first time that I came up against, quite by chance, the terrible history of the forced repatriations perpetrated by the Allies, not just the British and the Americans, though of course they were the chief offenders, but also every other country in Western Europe, more or less. Even Switzerland expelled Russians who had sought refuge there. And the Swedes handed over the people from the Baltic states to be sent back, who'd escaped in little boats across the Baltic Sea. It said there was an exchange for 1 million tons of Russian coal. I'm not sure about that. And it was, but there was only one country in Europe, in Western Europe, which refused to hand any Russians back, and that was Liechtenstein, which had a police force, I think, at the time of 7 and no army. And I remember, it always stuck in my mind, when I went to Liechtenstein to interview people concerned with this episode, which I felt was a very important one because it was such a contrast to the way in which the all-powerful Western Allies had behaved. And I said to the prince, "But weren't you nervous? After all, the Soviets were in Austria, and the boundaries weren't settled yet." And the prince just said, "I spoke to them firmly, and that, after all, is the language they understand," which in my book, Victims of Yalta, I said might have been a lesson for Roosevelt and Churchill, if they'd contemplated it. Because actually the awful operations which I described, mainly in 2 books and in other sources, were, I would argue, unnecessary. Stalin never at any time threatened to do anything which would damage the Western Allies. He couldn't, because he was acutely embarrassed by the fact that there were unknown maybe 3, 4, 5 million people escaped from the Soviet Union who would go to any lengths, including committing suicide, not to go back again. And this was something, of course, that couldn't be known about the workers' paradise. It was also suppressed largely in Western newspapers. I read all the English newspapers for that period, looking for information when I began writing my book. I found one solitary mention, and that was sneering at the people who were saying that Soviet citizens did not wish to return and that this was simply capitalist propaganda. That was all we were allowed to know when these things were going on. And it shows the need, too, for some sort of openness in these things, which are involving the fates of millions of human beings. But as I say, when I was arrested and put in a police cell for objecting to Bulgaria and Khrushchev, a nice police sergeant came to bring me some supper, and he stayed chatting with me, and he asked me why I felt so strongly about this. And I think people probably in our Russian church had mentioned to me about people being sent back to the Soviet Union, but if I knew anything about it, I thought it was just something awkward, and I mean, the chaos of the post-war period, immediate post-war period, almost anything could happen, and it was regrettable but understandable. And this policeman said, he said, it's funny you should say that, because he said, 11 years ago, I was in Austria in the army, and we had to put Russians onto trains to take them back home. And he said, we were just waiting and longing to get our demobilization and go back to England. But these people were so horrified at going back, they were throwing themselves off the trains and deliberately landing on their heads to break their necks. And he said, none of us could understand why they didn't want to go home. And I said, well, exactly, and that's what is so terrible about it, that people simply don't understand. Well, I remained very concerned about these things, but like most people, largely ignorant of them, until quite by chance I was alerted to the fact, this would have been in about 1973, I think, that the British government, under a new 30-year rule, whereby the archives were being released instead of 50 years, which it had been up to then, it now became after 30 years. And a friend of mine, Ukrainian, had been to a lecture, and he'd heard that amongst this was documentation relating to the forcible repatriation. And I was very intrigued, and I went to look at it. And I suddenly realized there was a huge amount of documentation that this was a story which could now possibly be told properly in a book. It was no longer just a question of the maybe dubious memoirs of confused people, the very few whom I used to meet who had managed to escape the net and come to England. And so I determined to sit down and write a book about it. It was a far bigger task than I ever imagined, because though going through the British archives was a lengthy and laborious business, that was at least straightforward. But what I realized was most important was to, as far as I possibly could, to capture the memories of people who had been involved. And this meant, of course, not only escaped Russian refugees, whose stories anyway were, though interesting, didn't throw any great light on the larger issues, but on I had to track down as many British soldiers, British officers, German officers and German soldiers, eyewitnesses in Austria and elsewhere who had seen these things going on. I went to America, to Canada, and in those days that was the only way it could be done. Of course, there was one very big gap in my knowledge, which obviously had to remain permanent then, and that was there was no remote possibility of seeing the Soviet archives, or later, which I would like to have seen, but which still haven't been opened, of course, the archives in Belgrade. That was something, of course, we thought we might never see, but I always remained optimistic, and I keep at home with gives me some idle pleasure, an English newspaper article in 1986, which described me as one of those romantic white Russians who dreams that he'll see St. Petersburg back on the map. Well, I only had to wait 4 years, and back came St. Petersburg. And then I remember being quoted on another occasion, I said correctly, I did say that I would like to have a Russian passport again, but only when it has the two-headed eagle on the front of it. And again, my friend smiled, and now I have such a passport, and it does have the two-headed eagle on the front of it. So things do change, and in a way it was a strange feeling living through it. I mean, not through direct experience, of course, but seeing the world change about us. And now, for me, this is a really historic moment to see this wonderful museum, obviously very well run by enthusiasts, such a large audience coming here to remember these awful events. Because it seems to me, and that's the whole point of writing my books, and now so many other excellent books have come out and are coming out, that we must put these terrible tragedies, related tragedies, but different, we must record them for history. We must record, most important perhaps, the oral evidence of people who experienced these things from whatever angle. Because after all, we'll all be dead one day, and oral evidence is unbelievably important. Of course, it's not the only form of evidence, and perhaps from the historian's point of view, maybe not quite the most important, but nevertheless, it is essential. And we must collect these things, because even now the political situation can change. It's worrying in Russia, where in the 1990s, President Yeltsin signed a decree that I was to be allowed a free run of the Russian archives and to see whatever I wished to see. And as far as I can tell, I'm sure there were things they were keeping hidden, but it was amazing what I was able to see. And again, I remember a telling little indication when I arrived in Moscow to do my research in the archives. I first went to see General Dmitry Volkogonov, who was a well-known biographer of Stalin and Lenin and Trotsky, and who was in charge of all the archives in Moscow. And I went to see him, and he explained to me that this ministry and that ministry would be seeing me. And then he paused at one point, and he said, I just don't understand why the English don't understand what everyone in Russia knows is true. Well, he was referring to the trial in which I became involved with Lord Aldington. Again, a completely unexpected episode in my life, especially looking back to when I first took my initial faltering steps in discovering what had been going on. Because there was I think many people here will be vaguely aware of it, we had a big trial in England when I had accused the man who had been the British Chief of Staff in Austria and who was responsible in consequence for drawing up the orders and seeing that they were implemented, for handing over the tens of thousands of Croats, Serbs, Slovenes and Montenegrins who were handed back by the British in the latter part of May 1945, and most of whom, of course, were massacred. And Lord Aldington was persuaded, much against his will, to sue me for libel. Well, it's notorious and becoming more notorious, especially nowadays in the newspapers, that the English libel laws are very, very peculiar indeed and do seem to be designed to protect the rich and the powerful. But nevertheless, however that may be, the trial was of great interest. It aroused huge publicity in Britain, and I think had far more effect than any book that I've written on drawing people's attention to what had happened. That wasn't, of course, my intention, and it wasn't I who wished to go to court. But having gone to court, I thought, well, the evidence is so clear that clearly we must win. But I began to realize a little bit, but only a little, of what it was like to be involved in the sort of show trials that were established in communist countries. And, but it was a curious timing. The verdict of the trial came out in I think it was November 1989, when I was fined £1.5 million for making this accusation. And within, by January, things were starting to change here very dramatically, and also in Croatia and Serbia. So I thought this is an opportunity, who knows which way it will go, this is an opportunity I can't miss. And I flew first of all to Belgrade, and there I interviewed a man, among others, interviewed General Milan Basta, who took over the Croats, who was turned back at Bleiburg. Basta, some Serbian journalists had asked him if he would see me, and he said, no, I don't want to see that scoundrel Tolstoy. He's an enemy of communism. But then my friend said, well, look, we'll just go around and we'll see him and see if we can't see him all the same. So we went quite early in the morning, and Basta came out in his dressing gown. And he looked at me, he said, who's that? And they said who I was. But he relaxed, and he said, you better come in. And he seemed, I don't know if he really was a very nice man, but he was certainly very pleasant. But a much less pleasant man I interviewed there was the notorious Simo Dubajic, the butcher of Kočevje, who was in charge, appointed directly by Tito, for the slaughters that took place in the Kočevski Rog. And he was, I must say, a very strange person, and an eye-opener to me for a certain type of communist mentality. And he said to me, he said to me, you have to understand that I was a convinced communist at that time, and if Tito had told me to murder my grandmother, I would have been very happy to do it. And then he said, well, but now I've given up all that, I've become orthodox like you. And to my horror, because we were conducting this interview in a cafe out in the open street, and there were journalists there, Dubajic, who was a strange-looking man, he had huge moustaches, suddenly embraced me in an emotional moment. And I was terrified that someone would take a photograph of this, but thank goodness they didn't. But actually I heard later that for all Dubajic's claim that he'd become orthodox and given up his communism, he was in trouble for going out and murdering some poor Croatian civilians. So I don't think, the leopard clearly didn't change his spots. And then I I came to Zagreb, where I interviewed many people, and then finally here to Slovenia, where the most interesting man to me was Colonel Hočevar, who, is he still alive? I don't know. But he was quite young in 1945, so he may well be. And he was extremely interesting, and I think spoke to me, with one exception, extremely frankly. I don't know why. And I took care, of course, to tape record the interview. And he told me some extremely interesting things, and which would have certainly been interesting to know during the trial in England. For example, Lord Aldington, or Brigadier Lowe as he had been, issued an order, and there was no question that he'd issued it, his name was on it, that the people being handed over to Tito, the order says, shall not be told of their destination. And they were led to believe they were going to Italy in safety. But in fact, of course, this was a trick to send them over to be killed. And Aldington, in court on oath, denied. He said, I never gave such an order. And, oh no, I'm so sorry, his name isn't on the written order, but he was responsible. So he claimed that he'd never issued the order and knew nothing of it himself. But Hočevar told me of his meeting with Aldington, and he said that Aldington told me not to worry because I'm giving this order that they're to be told they're going to Italy. But in fact, they'll change the junction on the railway, the points, and they'll all be sent through the Rosenbach tunnel into Slovenia, and then you can do what you like with them. So all this information was sort of, for me, has come out in rather strange ways, in dribs and drabs, sometimes by interviewing surviving people, the three survivors of the pit of Kočevje, whom I found living in Canada. Sadly, I think they're all now dead. But I was able to make long tape-recorded interviews with them. And so this information came bit by bit. And in my book, The Minister and the Massacres, which was published in 1986, I was able to put in a lot of this information. But now, I suppose, like most historians, when I look at the book, I feel like I'm embarrassed because I can see mistakes straight away. But to be fair to myself, I suppose, the mistakes largely arise from not knowing things which I now know. A great deal of new information has come out, less from eyewitnesses, much more from the archives. Of course, from the point of view of the handovers of Cossacks and Russians, now I suppose I know as much more about what happened as I did when I wrote the book, The Minister and the Massacres, because there I do have at home copies of, thousands of copies of documents from the Russian archives, even from the documents of Smersh, from Stalin's cabinet and so on. So one can pretty well show what happened from beginning to end. And I shall have to write another book, completely new book, setting it all out. But the great advantage of such a book would be that I no longer have to say, which my critics, of course, made much play of, here is the evidence, it looks as though this is what happened, which is, to my mind, what historians are supposed to say and do. But some hostile journalists, there aren't that many, I'm glad to say, were critical on that account. Well, now I would hardly need to do that. There are one or two blank spaces left. But in the case of the victims sent across be handed over to Tito, of course, the work being done here is absolutely vital and fascinating to me because there's an awful lot that we don't know. There's been no, at least not to my knowledge, general release of archives from Belgrade. So much of the decisions of what went on, it's clear, of course, that Tito bore direct responsibility and supervised everything that went on. As Dubaic said to me when I asked him who gave the order for the slaughter of the Slovenians in Kočevski Rog, he looked at me as if I was a bit of an idiot. He said, well, obviously it was Tito. Tito knew everything and Tito gave all the orders. But it would be far more satisfactory if we had a full documentation, such as we have, for example, issued by the Russian Commission in the 1990s on the Katyn slaughter, where long before, I'm afraid, before the British government actually acknowledged that it was the Soviets who murdered the Polish officers and not the Nazis, out came this massive volume I've got at home containing all the relevant documents, giving all the orders and discussions from Stalin right down to the executioners receiving their orders. So there's an awful lot, especially here in former Yugoslavia, to discover. And I think it's so important that it should be discovered. It's important for historians to know the truth. It's important that history should actually take notice of major events, which, if you read earlier histories from up to the 1980s of Yugoslavia, written in England by the sort of, I would call them a sort of mini mafia of people who'd served, many of them who'd served in the war with SOE in Yugoslavia, and who then managed to get hold of most of the academic posts in England dealing with the history of Yugoslavia. So it was a very, very slanted history, but a slanted history with colossal gaps in it. The whole history of what we're here today to commemorate and discuss was simply not mentioned, just was not mentioned. You wouldn't find it in any of the books by people like Stevenson and Deakin and Fitzroy MacLean and so on. It's not there. And we have to make sure that the history is there. In Russia, I'm a bit concerned because things which looked so promising in the 1990s under Yeltsin with regard to release of archives was proceeding very well, and there was a marvelous man whose name I've momentarily forgotten who was in charge of opening the archives. I saw quite a lot of him, and he was absolutely dedicated to bringing the truth out, truth of course in its broad historical sense. And much has been published in this series, so thank goodness that the clock cannot be turned back, that once a book is published and circulated, there'll always be a copy surviving somewhere. But now, unfortunately, one reads that today in Russia there seems to be some bit of turning back the clock, and especially the pronouncements of the Russian government, or some members of the Russian government, on Mr. Putin, I'm afraid, and Mr. Lavrov, on, for instance, on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, looked to me not only patently untrue, but embarrassing for any Russian that such childish utterances could be given. It was Poland who committed the first aggression against Germany, that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was no different in essence from Chamberlain's agreement at Munich. Well, of course, there was all the difference in the world. Chamberlain's agreement at Munich was the agreement of a man whom I and many other people would, I think, look upon as an honourable, possibly, but not certainly, misguided, but a man who hated Nazism and was determined one way or the other to do what he could to resist its spread. But when Stalin, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Stalin expressed huge admiration for Hitler, who was even more effective than he. And after all, one has to remember that Stalin and Hitler were allies for nearly 2 years, and that it was only when Hitler foolishly broke the agreement and invaded the Soviet Union that Stalin, and even then with huge reluctance, came to accept that he and Hitler would not get on together. Again, largely I think because of wartime propaganda when we needed the Soviets on our side. This history was clouded not only in the Soviet Union, where of course a completely imaginary history was written, but also sadly in the West, where I think there are still people in England I meet who believe that Stalin, when he signed the pact, was simply buying time in order to prepare himself for the coming fight with Hitler. It's simply untrue. He never took any measure of any sort. On the contrary, he was totally unaware and unprepared, and as a result, Russia suffered such fearfully in the Second World War. Really, one could say, largely or almost entirely, the responsibility must lie on Stalin's shoulders. But I'm hopeful about the situation in Russia. I don't know how far Mr. Putin has to say these things to keep the still lingering communist party and happy. Whether he really believes such things himself, I find it hard to believe. And I hope that Russia will somehow struggle through this smutное время, another time of troubles, which Russia has known so often. But here, of course, the situation is vastly more promising. There's the communists, I know from my friends, that they're still hanging around. But of course, if you've committed yourself to supporting an ideology and a political program which is now 100% discredited, it's very difficult for people simply to shed everything that they've lived for, and so it lingers on. But it is a mentality, of course, which will just die out. There's no question about that in my mind. But we mustn't let it just die. We must see that it goes, and goes in the best way possible by making the truth of these historical events, as I say, in the broadest sense, not a simple truth, known and recorded permanently, not so much that these things won't happen again, because nothing ever happens again precisely, but so that the sufferings of the people involved are not forgotten, and that, in the general sense that we understand history, that we're looking at a real history and not a fanciful one. So I'm very honoured to be here and grateful to you for inviting me again to beautiful Slovenia. Thank you.
The sequence of the documentary we saw at the beginning, there was also a statement of Mr. Hucheva. He was expressing his sorrow that he didn't know what will happen in Slovenia after returning these people from Austria. As you see, we are still in the process of establishing the basic facts. Slovenia has the name list of the victims. We are discovering massacres and so on. But Slovenia is also a European problem in questions of sources, in question of victims that were killed here. We are let's say, connected with nearly the whole Europe. And this question, you are on my side in quite a comfortable position. As a Russian, you can criticize Britain. As living in Britain, you can criticize Russia. Can you tell perhaps this dire necessity or conspiracy? Because it's for a small country like Slovenia, it's a more painful question. Perhaps a few words on Slovenian case.
Oh yes, and you mean about the sort of conspiratorial?
Yes, what's the answer you
yes,
are
of course.
preparing to give in your paper?
Yes, I was speaking quite generally, but on the question of the forced repatriation of the Slovenes who were sent back from British-occupied Austria, sorry, in May 1945, something which struck me, originally it struck me very clearly with the case of the Cossacks, who were also, of course, in Austria, who were handed back, that there was not just a piece of blind realpolitik on the part of the Allies. There was something much more strange and indeed sinister about it, namely that these handovers were not only unnecessary, but they were not actually desired by the leaders of Allied policy. It is an absolutely straightforward matter of fact that Churchill at no time was informed about the handover of the Cossacks, that he was in fact totally hostile to it, and insofar as he was involved, he was attempting to take measures to make sure that the Cossacks were not handed back. And yet they were, so that became for me something of first importance to discover why. Then I remember when I think my book, Victims of Yalta, had come out, in which I had a chapter in the middle of the book which I called it an unsolved mystery, which was particularly why those Cossacks who were not Soviet citizens, who were people like myself or my father, who were from the old regime and who had never lived in the Soviet Union. And the Yalta Agreement says absolutely explicitly that it is Soviet citizens who will be returned, and under international law, considerations of humanity and so on, it's inconceivable that there could be any justification for handing over people who had never been Soviet citizens. And I wanted to get to the bottom of this, and I suppose I was spurred more than other people because of my own Russian background, and I even thought, if I'd happened to be in Austria then, it was only chance that brought my father to England, we would have been handed over as well. And when my book came out, and before I had got anything near the bottom of this, the conspiracy relating to the Cossacks, I remember a Slovenian emigre in London saying to me, well, why don't you write about our tragedy? And at that time I didn't know very much about it. It had been a massive task to write about the handover of Soviet citizens. And I thought, well, I'm not really, not an expert on that subject at all. I don't know if I can write it. But the more I went on, I began to realize all the time that in the sources there were references to the handover of people to Tito. And then I began to think, well, maybe if I study that properly, it will throw a light on the Cossacks. So initially it was only as a sort of aid to my main aim. But before long I became increasingly fascinated, and I realized that here was another conspiracy taking place in the same part of the world at the very same time. Equally, it became absolutely clear that there was no justification. I'm not talking about moral justification, obviously there never could be that, but no political justification for handing them over, and that it was a subject of importance in itself. And so when I wrote The Minister and the Massacres in 1986, the book is roughly divided half and half between the fate of the Cossacks and the fate of the different peoples from Yugoslavia. Now the cases were, in a sense, ran together, parallel, and in some senses different. The position, if I use the term Yugoslavs, you'll understand what I mean. I'm using it in the sense it was used in 1945, rather than constantly saying Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, etc. The position of all people from Yugoslavia who had escaped into Austria was absolutely crystal clear. Both the British and American governments said from the outset that no Yugoslavs, whoever they are, even unless they were actual identifiable war criminals, even Croatian Ustaše, were to be handed over. It doesn't say so, but quite clearly the reason is because they could not possibly expect a fair trial. Indeed, presumably, as proved to be the case, no trial at all. And these orders were transmitted on the ground through the Supreme Allied Commander in Naples, Field Marshal Alexander, to the British Fifth Corps in Austria, that you are to retain these people until you receive further instructions. But everything changed, as it had done with the Cossacks, when Harold Macmillan, the minister-resident, that's to say the political advisor to Alexander, unexpectedly flew on the 13th of May into Klagenfurt and conferred for an hour or so with the British commander, General Keighley. And as General Keighley reported shortly afterwards, Macmillan gave a verbal directive. This is a sort of, not a euphemism really, but of course Macmillan could not give an order, because all soldiers can only receive orders from their superiors. But he gave something, and the term verbal directive shows pretty clearly that it was a very strong piece of advice, I suppose one could put it. And yet, for some reason, and these are things which we don't really know, the British Fifth Corps general, who was by all accounts, from people I met who knew him, a rather ruthless type. I remember an Austrian who acted as his interpreter, describing him as, well, rather like the worst type of Prussian officer. So a lot of it was bad luck, I think, that such a general was there. Anyway, he took it on himself to hand over the Cossacks. And it looks very much as if it was, or it must have been, I think, at the same meeting that Macmillan, as he says in his diary, the question of people, refugees from Yugoslavia, was also raised. Now, Macmillan does not say what he recommended in response to that, and presumably because his diary was intended for publications, he couldn't say, because it would have been apparent that he was going against the policy and instructions of his own government. And immediately 5 Corps set in train motions for handing over all the refugees back to Tito. Now, if you want some examples of how the conspiracy worked, well, I found an interesting one when Lord Aldington, as I'll call him, but he wasn't yet Lord Aldington then, when he met with Colonel Hocevar to discuss the handovers on the 15th of May, he reported, in the report which still survives, that we agreed to hand over all Croats within our territory. The Croats, of course, were unpopular because many of them had fought on the German side, unpopular in British eyes. And also, the Croats seemed to fall into a rather convenient category because a vast mass of some 200,000 Croats had been halted at Bleiburg by the British and not allowed to surrender and sent back. And though that is, Bleiburg is the word used in Croatia as a sort of shorthand for the handovers, as I've pointed out, I don't think that can really be considered as a war crime, because they had never surrendered. They were not allowed to surrender, and I have some considerable sympathy for the point of view of the local British command, that they simply could not admit such a... They didn't even know that it was only 200,000. They just saw this huge column coming over the Karavanka Mountains, and they knew they couldn't handle them. But some 35,000 Croats did manage to infiltrate the British lines and were immediately put into camps. And they were passed off to higher command as being part of the 200,000 who'd been turned back, and that this therefore justified their being handed back. But anyway, however that may be, the interesting thing is that when I saw Colonel Hocheba, I said to him, now, did J. Below agree with you, as it says in this, I showed him the report, to hand over Croats to you? And he said, no, that wasn't the agreement at all. It was to hand over all Yugoslav citizens. And he said, in fact, I wasn't concerned about the Croats because the Croats were in the east, and they were the responsibility of the Yugoslav Third Army. He said, no, it's not my responsibility. I was only concerned with the Serbian Chetniks and Slovenian and Croatian Domobranci and Domobrani. So there shows, and as that is in fact what happened, one can see that Lord Aldington, not for the first time, was simply not telling the truth. But from a historical point of view, historian's point of view, it's not so much interesting whether or not Aldington was a liar, but of course what actually was going on and why this policy was being put through so surreptitiously. Because the next move was that it had been reported to Field Marshal Alexander that 5 Corps in Austria had a large number of Cossacks and of Yugoslavs, and immediately, what was Alexander's response? Where I'm told quite often, oh well, you know, it was 5 Corps couldn't handle all these people, what else could you do with them, and so on and so forth. Well, the man who had the biggest responsibility of all, and the best means of knowing what could or could not be done, was of course Alexander, the commander, whose responsibilities extended into Austria. He immediately got on to Eisenhower in Germany and Churchill in London, and said, we need to clear these people out of the way in Austria, because there was the big fear, brief but real, that there would be war with Tito, who was trying to occupy part of southern Carinthia and also part of Venetia Julia. And this was a real consideration towards the end of the month. So he said, we need to clear the core area of these people. Eisenhower's initial response was to say, I can't take anyone in Schäf in Germany area, because we've got millions of German prisoners of war, millions of refugees, we simply can't handle them. But Churchill, having got an identical appeal from Alexander, appealed to Eisenhower and said, look, please could you at least take the Cossacks? And Eisenhower, all this happened within 24 hours, changed his mind completely. He said, yes, we can take the Cossacks, we'll look after them. And meanwhile, Alexander had made arrangements, or ordered arrangements to be made, for receiving all the Yugoslav nationals who had been infiltrated and surrendered in Austria to be sent to camps. And this wasn't a sort of a fanciful idea that it might or might not take place, or might not have been practicable. We've got in the orders lists of the actual camps, the number of people they could take, and they extend right down Italy and indeed into North Africa. And no one at any time on Alexander's staff suggested that this was impractical. It was belatedly suggested that there were difficulties in, at Aldington's trial. They said, oh well, it would have been very difficult getting them by train across the mountains into Italy. That a bit of further research showed that the trains in fact were running perfectly normally and there wouldn't have been a problem. Anyway, one might ask whether, as some remember a Serbian academic posed the question in the correspondence, that wouldn't these people, if as indeed appeared might be the case, Britain and the United States were going to war with Tito, wouldn't these thousands of anti-communist fighters who of course knew their own country and could speak their own languages, wouldn't they be extremely useful in the case of such a war? But this question, of course, has never been answered. Because in the meanwhile, 5 Corps, evidently under following, for whatever reason, I don't quite know, Macmillan's instructions, were continuing to prepare as fast as they could for handing the people over. And then from the 19th of May, starting with the Croats, I think, then Serbs, and then they were finally planning to hand over all the Slovenes, mostly in the camp at Viktrim, to hand them over as well. And then there occurred an extraordinary intervention, which shows how little people, or relatively little people, on the ground, even in such terrible situations where everything seems to be, and all the powers that be are determined on one course, where quite small people can actually alter the course of history and save lives. The camp at Victory was not administered by the Five Corps. It didn't occupy any British troops needed to fight against Tito. It was administered by Allied military government, which was a different arm of the command, responsible for things like setting up hospitals, making sure that the infrastructure worked and so on, and in this case administering the camps. Of course, nobody wanted to escape from the camps as long as they thought they were safe there. The last thing they wanted, they were only too relieved to be outside the Tito's grasp. And the commandant of the camp was a Canadian officer called Major Barre, whom I came to know extremely well when I went to see him in Montreal, and afterwards he came in England to testify at our trial. And when he received the order that these people were going to be handed over, he absolutely said, this will not happen. I cannot allow these. We know perfectly well what will happen to these people. They'll be killed, and this simply cannot happen. And he then got in touch with there was a representative of the British Red Cross in Austria, Sir John Selby Bigg, who was equally outraged at the thought of this. And Selby Bigg then went, as he realized he was getting nowhere with Keatley, who was ruthlessly intent on handing over every last man, woman and child, Selby Bigg went with a companion and they drove across the mountains down into Italy and went to see the commander of 8th Army, the 8th Army being the next stage higher from the Five Corps in Austria, and went to see General McCreary, the commander of Five Corps. General McCreary, by all accounts, was a great friend of Alexander. He was a very rather gentle man, as quite often British, or I think generals in many armies are, surprisingly so. And according to Selby Bigg's own account, McCreary was absolutely horrified. Also horrified about what was happening to the Cossacks, of which he had no inkling until that moment. And McCreary immediately sent an order to Keatley to halting the operations. And I'm still not clear whether it was because of this or because of other more general considerations that Field Marshal Alexander himself on the I think it was the 4th of June, but don't have to. Anyway, in the first or second week of June, Field Marshal Alexander himself flew to Austria and, among other things, toured the camp at Victory and confirmed an order which had already been issued as a result of McCreary's intervention, saying that there's a new army order and that no one will be handed over anymore. And this put a complete halt to it. Now, before I came out here, I was rereading the different succession of orders, and what's very interesting is to see there's the sort of last orders which I have in my collection relevant to this, that when Macmillan had come back from Austria, he had recommended to the chief administrative officer, General Robertson, that both the Cossacks and the Yugoslavs should all be handed over. And then Robertson went to see, having received this advice from Macmillan, Robertson then went to see Macmillan's American counterpart, Alexander Kirk, who was, again, as luckily dotted among all these people, were people of different characters, and Kirk was also, I think he'd been a diplomat as I recall, in the Soviet Union at the time of the show trials at the American Embassy in Moscow. So he had a pretty good idea of what went on in these communist countries and how they dealt with their victims. And Kirk immediately said, no, you can't do this, it's contrary to agreed policy between the British and American governments. Robertson evidently said something non-committal, went away and sent the order which Macmillan had asked for straight to Keatley and provided the justification for this. Well, belatedly, none of this, after that, I think Kirk presumably assumed that his intervention had been successful. He certainly doesn't seem to have had any other information. until it began to come out in July of the hideous scenes which had taken place in Austria, especially among the Cossacks, when people were, men, women and children were beaten, clubbed, sometimes killed, thrown into cattle trucks to be handed over to the lasting shame of the British Army and acute distress of most of the soldiers involved, of all ranks. And Kirk then presented a new protest, or at least it was no longer Kirk, it was Kirk, I think, had returned, but his deputy, Offe, sent a letter to Alexander and saying, we now understand that, contrary to our protest, these people were, Slovenes, Serbs and Croats, were handed over, and it was contrary also to Allied policy and the advice we'd received. And Alexander's deputy, the American General Lemnitzer, replied with a very, I would say, rather extremely evasive and inaccurate account of what had happened, namely that Alexander claimed that Alexander had decided that in view of the military situation on the ground this had to happen, and his responsibility as Supreme Allied Commander meant that he had to ignore advice that he normally would have heeded, and that, as far as they were concerned, was the end of the story. Alexander's reply sent through his deputy is full of inaccuracies, and which it's obviously one of those things which, as anyone who's served in the military in any capacity knows, that one thing soldiers don't do is wash their dirty linen in public, as we say in England. And Alexander had done his best to stop the business, but now it was too late and he couldn't do anything about it. So this is what I refer to as the conspiracy. There are aspects which still remain mysterious. It is possible now to show, and if you look on, I shall write something about this, I think after when I get home, to be published here. But in the meantime, if you want to see more the actual orders themselves and the succession, I did write, I'd forgotten I'd done it and noticed it the other day, for some Croatian friends, an account which broadly applies also, because the decisions were relating to the Slovenes as well, of these orders and how they worked. And it's on the internet, and I think I found if you just put in Tolstoy and Bleiburg, you can find it. And that's, for me, but that was actually written about 9 years ago, I think, so I think probably I would have more to add now. But even so, I think it gives a broadly accurate picture. The only thing I would say is, for me, the biggest mystery still is the motives which led these effectively illicit operations to take place. Now, we know that Alexander was totally hostile to him. Keighley was not a man, he was probably a rather harsh and unfeeling and unimaginative man by all accounts. I did say probably, that's what his own close colleagues told me. I would have spoken to Keighley himself, but by a curious chance, when I wrote to him asking for an interview back in the 70s, he actually died, I hope it wasn't a result of my letter, on the day my letter arrived. But I think he might or might not have spoken to me. Of course, the best witness of all would have been Field Marshal Alexander, who was a man of impeccable integrity and honour. And I think, had he been alive, which he wasn't when I was writing my book, I suspect he would have spoken to me and spoken to me truthfully. But his deputy, General Morgan, certainly told me that when Alexander got the news, he, Morgan, was present. Whether Alexander's, Morgan put it, hit the roof. He was absolutely outraged to think this had happened within his command. So the real mystery is Macmillan's motive. And people are always asking me that, and I have to say straight away, I simply do not know. And as a historian, sorry, I can say that I just don't know, and so therefore anything that I did say would be guesswork. But on the other hand, it's rather like the Sherlock Holmes's famous pronouncement on the dog that failed to bark in the night. That's enough of Sherlock Holmes's pronouncements. No, on Sherlock Holmes said that when you've eliminated the impossible, then you're left with what actually happened. Well, you can eliminate on the evidence, which is very clear, quite a number of possible motives, and they're often put to me either by well-wishers or ill-wishers. And they say, well, for a start, they had to clear the 5 Corps area. I mentioned that there was the danger of war with Tito, and that it was necessary to act very swiftly and perhaps ruthlessly in face of this major crisis. The crisis was certainly real enough, and I don't pay nearly enough attention to it. I can see now with hindsight in my book, The Minister and the Massacres. The crisis with Tito is actually extremely important in this context. But actually, the crisis, so far from justifying the handovers, makes them even more incredible. I mentioned that Eisenhower had agreed to take the Cossacks in Germany. And, but then, as the days moved on, everything happened very quickly in May 1945, and the Allies were making very serious preparations. They were happily prepared to go to war with Tito. And Eisenhower gave orders, and General Patton was told to take 2 cavalry corps across the mountains down into Austria. And Patton's order was typical of Patton. It says, he just wrote, if Tito plays ball, fine. If not, kick him out. But part of the plan was that the Americans should move in and should take over the valley of the Drau and Lienz, where the Cossacks were held, thus relieving 5 Corps of any responsibility for the Cossacks at one stroke. They wouldn't even have to be removed to Germany, as was the earlier plan. And Patton's, being Patton, got his troops across the snow-bound mountains much quicker than anyone thought, especially 5 Corps. And I think it was about the 20th of May that the first American troops arrived on the edge of the 5 Corps area, and the local unit there reported to Aldington, at 5 Corps headquarters, that the Americans have arrived and say they've got orders to take over this bit of our area to relieve us of responsibility. And what was Aldington's response? He immediately sent a telegram to McCreary saying, the Americans are now trying to move into our area, we do not need them. So on the 20th of May, he could have been, or 5 Corps could have been relieved of all responsibility for the Cossacks by doing nothing whatever. And instead, they spent a long, troublesome and brutal operation in sending them all far to the east into the hands of the Soviets. And in the same way, this relief would have meant that 5 Corps was not intended to do the major fighting. That was going to be done by the American cavalry units. The people held at Victory and elsewhere could either have stayed put or, following Alexander's instructions, have been sent south into Italy. There just was no problem. So I can dismiss that completely. It wasn't a question of realpolitik. In fact, realpolitik would have said, obey your orders, let the Americans take over the Cossacks, let all the Yugoslavs go down into Italy. But these were the orders that were disobeyed or flouted. Then they say, well, we had to keep Stalin and Tito happy. Well, there was no suggestion. Stalin, they began preparations for handing over the Cossacks before the delegation from Smersh, and I have a transcript of the Smersh delegation coming in. Even I have a video of an interview with the commander of the unit who came in to negotiate the handover. This was done without any threat from the Soviets. Indeed, there was no threat from the Soviets, and historians, I think, ought to look at a very fascinating side aspect of this, is that Patton was prepared to move his troops with their left flank facing the triumphant Red Army in Austria. And there's no suggestion in any of the American or British archives that anybody was worried that the Red Army might intervene in the event of war with Tito. There just is no suggestion. I don't know the answer to that. I think but probably, actually, Stalin by then knew the Americans had got the atomic bomb. But anyhow, for whatever reason, Stalin was not inclined to rash ventures, was just not going to interview. And it's very clear, too, that Eisenhower and Patton were confident, sufficiently confident, they knew that Stalin was not going to intervene. So there must be some other reason for Macmillan's strange intervention. And as I frequently pointed out in his lifetime, he always refused to be interviewed by me. There were only 2 people who refused to be interviewed by me, and among all the myriads of people I interviewed, including very senior British officers, and they were Aldington and Macmillan. And when I was accused of falsely accusing Macmillan, I replied every time, I said, but if there's another story more creditable to Macmillan than the one I've told, Mr. Macmillan is alive and in full possession of his wits, why can't he tell us what it was? And I remember, I'll end on this note for the moment, that when I had a great supporter, a marvellous man, Sir Bernard Brain, later became Lord Brain, and he was the father of the House of Commons. And the more he looked into the story, and as I showed him the information, the more horrified he became. And it was he who helped organise the memorial to the victims of this policy, which is now erected in London. And he said to me, look, I'm very worried. He was inclined to think the best of Macmillan. He said, I'm very worried about this, I think, because Harold will die before long. He knew Macmillan pretty well. And it'll look very bad that he hasn't answered what you've said. And I think he's making a big mistake. So he said, I know his son very well, Maurice Macmillan, who was also an MP. He said, I'm thinking I'll ask him if he won't persuade his father to speak either to you or publicly about what really happened. And I said, I think that's a brilliant idea, and I hope it's successful. And a few days later I saw Bernard, and I said, did you get any luck out of Maurice Macmillan? And he said, no, I didn't. He said, Maurice came to me, and he said, I've spoken to my father, and he won't even tell me what happens, and he certainly won't tell anyone else. So I think on that basis it's reasonable to assume that there was not a plausible, or a reasonable answer to it, and one has to look to, I don't know, I think I can guess, but it would be only a guess, I won't say.
So, a lot of things were told, a lot of questions were opened. I think for the future is the most important. I suggest now a coffee break. We will